played trombone because they watched Star Trek and they were big fans of the show. I think gorgeous cinematography, and especially all the new Star Trek, encouraged to shoot sort of cinematically and filmically. And
before Star Trek became the most influential science fiction franchise in television history, it came extraordinarily close to never existing at all. What audiences saw when the show finally aired in September 1966 was a carefully polished version of something far messier, far stranger, and in certain moments far more disturbing than the network ever intended the public to see. Behind the gleaming corridors of a USS Enterprise, behind the iconic uniforms and the confident bridge crew, there was a production history filled with rejected pilots, erased characters, budget catastrophes, controversial scenes that nearly never aired, and creative decisions so unconventional that they should have sunk the entire project before a single episode reached a living room. The fact that Star Trek survived all of it is remarkable. The fact that so much of what it survived has been quietly buried makes the real story even more fascinating than the one that was allowed to be told. The beginning of that real story is not the premiere of the show in 1966. It is a single typed document produced on March 11, 1964, when a television writer named Gene Roddenberry sat down and drafted a short series proposal. Roddenberry was already an established professional. He had written extensively for Western television throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, contributing to shows like Have Gun Will Travel and Highway Patrol. His instincts were shaped by that genre, and they showed in his earliest concept. He described his new idea as Wagon Train to the Stars, a self-contained adventure format set aboard a large starship called the SS Yorktown, operating in the 23rd century with a crew tasked with exploring the galaxy. The captain of that original concept was not Kirk, not Pike, but a character named Robert April, a name that would be almost entirely erased from the public history of the franchise, surviving only in a single episode of the animated series decades later and a much later appearance in Strange New Worlds. The ship, the captain, and the entire premise were about to go through transformations so radical that almost nothing from that original document would survive intact. Roddenberry took the proposal to Desilu Productions in April 1964, where he met Herbert Solow, the studio's director of production, who saw genuine potential in the concept and signed Roddenberry to a development deal. Desilu was an unusual studio, founded by and associated with Lucille Ball. It had a reputation built primarily on comedy. Taking on two expensive hour-long dramatic series simultaneously, Star Trek and Mission Impossible, pushed the studio to its financial limits in ways that would nearly destroy both shows before either found its audience. In early 1966, Desilu came close to canceling Star Trek outright. The costs had grown beyond comfortable projections, and the returns were uncertain. It was Solow who intervened directly, persuading Lucille Ball to keep the project alive. Ball herself was not deeply familiar with the science fiction genre, but she recognized good creative instincts when she encountered them. Without her decision to continue, the show dies in pre-production, and the entire cultural history of the franchise simply does not happen. The first real test of the concept came with the production of a pilot episode called The Cage in late 1964. The captain in this version was Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter, a respected Hollywood actor who had recently played Jesus Christ in the 1961 film King of Kings. Roddenberry wanted a serious, philosophical tone, and Hunter delivered it. Pike was thoughtful, restrained, and genuinely complex in ways that differed sharply from what the show would eventually become. The pilot also featured a female first officer, known only as Number One, played by Majel Barrett. She was authoritative, composed, and clearly capable of command. When NBC received the finished pilot, their response was swift and brutal. They called it too intellectual, too slow, and insufficiently action-driven. The female first officer was specifically flagged as too controversial for mainstream American audiences in 1965. The network rejected the pilot entirely, which in television almost always means the end of a project. Instead, NBC did something almost unheard of in the industry at that time. They ordered a second pilot. The rejected footage was not destroyed. It was filed away, and Roddenberry would find a use for it years later. For the second pilot, nearly everything changed. Hunter walked away from the project. Accounts vary on whether this was his decision, his wife's influence, or a mutual parting with the production, and he was replaced by William Shatner. The female first officer was removed. The tone shifted from philosophical to kinetic. The new captain was not a man of quiet reflection, but a figure of bold action and magnetic confidence. Where Hunter's Pike had been internal, Shatner's Kirk was external. Every thought and emotion expressed outward with physical energy. Almost instantly, the entire character of the show changed with him. The transition was so fundamental that watching the two pilots back to back feels like watching two entirely different series that happen to share a spaceship design and one cast member. Leonard Nimoy, playing Spock, was the only actor carried over from the original pilot into the new version. Jeffrey Hunter died 3 years later at age 42, never seeing how completely the show he had helped launch would reshape popular culture. The salvage of the original pilot footage became one of the most creative acts of early Star Trek history. Rather than allowing the expensive production to sit in a vault unused, Roddenberry constructed a 2-part episode called The Menagerie around it, framing the original pilot footage as a story told in flashback through a court-martial proceeding. The episode won a Hugo Award, making the rejected original pilot, the one NBC had called too cerebral to air, into award-winning television through the simplest possible structural invention. It is one of the great acts of creative recycling in the history of the medium. What actually reached screens in 1966 continued to carry the residue of decisions made under extreme budget pressure, decisions that were hidden from audiences through ingenuity and clever editing. The most fundamental of these involved the ship's doors. Those smooth, futuristic sliding entrances, with their iconic whooshing sound, are now permanently embedded in the cultural memory of what the future is supposed to look and feel like. On the actual set, they were loud, mechanical, and deeply unglamorous. The pneumatic mechanism that operated them produced a heavy, grinding clunk that was entirely incompatible with the atmosphere the show was trying to create. Rather than building more sophisticated doors, the production team used editing. Characters developed the habit of pausing their dialogue whenever a door opened or closed, creating a small silence that editors could fill with a smooth sound added in post-production. Once you know to look for those pauses, they become visible in nearly every scene that involves a doorway. The audience was watching a carefully constructed illusion in which the entire sonic environment of the future had been fabricated around a mechanical limitation. The transporter, arguably the most culturally consequential piece of technology ever invented for a television show, had equally unglamorous origins. The original production plan called for the crew to travel between the ship and planet surfaces using shuttlecraft, which would have required exterior landing sequences and approach shots for every planetary visit. The cost of filming those sequences weekly was simply beyond the production budget. The transporter was invented as a cost-saving measure. The visual effect, figures dissolving and reassembling in a shower of sparkling light, was created by filming metallic material falling in front of a dark background, reversing the footage, and layering it with additional light effects. The entire process cost a fraction of what exterior shuttle sequences would have demanded. What began as a budget workaround became a concept so enduring that physicists at major research institutions have spent decades exploring whether actual quantum teleportation might be achievable, with experiments in quantum entanglement directly inspired by the fictional technology a television production team invented, because they could not afford to film a shuttle landing. The phasers carried by Starfleet officers had similarly humble origins. The prop department started with plastic toy ray guns already in the studio's inventory, cheap novelty items left over from earlier productions. These were repainted, modified with added components, and reshaped to suggest advanced technology. The result retained a slightly toy-like quality that attentive viewers noticed even at the time, but under studio lighting and with appropriate sound design, the illusion held well enough for a weekly television audience. The cultural influence of that repainted toy gun extended beyond television. The U.S. military has invested substantial resources over subsequent decades in directed energy weapons research, a field whose public imagination was substantially shaped by the phaser concept that started life as a discount prop department solution. The USS Enterprise itself, as a physical model, carried its own hidden compromise. The 11-foot filming model used for exterior shots was extraordinarily detailed on the surfaces that cameras would actually see. The top of the saucer section, the nacelles, the primary hull were all carefully finished and painted. The underside of the model was left largely incomplete, rough and unpainted in sections, because the production team correctly calculated that no camera angle would ever reveal it. The model is now preserved in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Visitors who know to look can see the unfinished underside of one of the most iconic vehicles in science fiction history, a monument to practical problem-solving under constraint. Among the most significant and most deliberately suppressed chapters of the show's production history was the episode that aired on November 22, 1968, featuring a kiss between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. NBC pushed back hard against the scene. Network executives proposed making the kiss involuntary, a product of alien telekinetic control, so that affiliate stations in southern markets could dismiss it as something that did not really happen between the two characters. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols found a different solution. They deliberately ruined every take in which they turned away from each other, making those versions unusable. The production was left with only the footage where they faced each other naturally, and that was what aired. The network had its technical cover story. The audience had the real moment. Nichols later described receiving a letter from a white Southern viewer who said that single scene caused him to fundamentally reconsider his own beliefs. A 30-second scene that the network spent significant effort trying to prevent or neutralize became one of the most socially consequential moments in the history of American television. Nichols herself had come within a day of leaving the show entirely before that episode was ever made. After the first season, she decided to return to the stage and submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. What reversed that decision was a conversation at an NAACP event where she found herself face-to-face with Martin Luther King Jr. He told her that Uhura was not simply a character. She was a symbol, the first black woman in a position of genuine authority and professional dignity on mainstream American television, visible to children who had never seen anyone who looked like them in such a role. King told her she could not leave. She withdrew her resignation the following day. The cultural history of the show, and by extension a significant portion of American television history, turned on a private conversation at a civil rights event that almost no one outside the two participants knew had taken place. What the studio erased turned out to matter less than what survived the erasure. And what survived did, so largely because the people making it refused to fully let go of what they originally